Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, pouring your coffee, turning on the news, and seeing a headline that makes your blood run cold. Enemy forces have seized territory inside the United States. Not a territory, not a base overseas, but actual American soil. A piece of the homeland, occupied by a foreign army, the rising sun flag fluttering over American earth. You de-panic. You de-grab your gun. You de-ask where the hell the military is. But what if I told you this is not a hypothetical scenario? What if I told you this actually happened? History books love to lie to you. They love to tell you that the United States has been a fortress, untouched by foreign invasion since 1812. They tell you that World War II was fought over there, in the hedgerows of France, on the black sands of Iwo Jima, in the skies over Berlin. They want you to believe that the war never came home. But that is a lie. There was a battle fought on American soil. A battle so brutal, so catastrophic, and so humiliating for the top brass, that they tried to bury it under 80 years of silence. It was not fought in the streets of New York or the beaches of California. It was fought in a place that God forgot and the devil fears. A place where the wind screams loud enough to drive men insane, and the fog is so thick you not see the hand in front of your face, let alone the enemy soldier waiting to stick a bayonet in your gut. This is the story of the invasion of Alaska, the story of the Battle of Attu. And it starts not with a roar, but with a whisper that the US government was terrified you would hear. In June 1942, while the rest of the country was staring at maps of Europe and the South Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a move that should have shattered American morale. They landed on Attu and Kiska, two volcanic islands in the Aleutian chain off the coast of Alaska. These were not just rocks in the ocean, they were the backdoor to the North American continent. General Billy Mitchell once said, "He who holds Alaska holds the world." The Japanese understood this. If they could turn the Aleutians into an airbase, they could bomb Seattle. They could strike the Boeing factories. They could paralyze the West Coast. When the Japanese soldiers stepped onto the mossy, freezing tundra of Attu, they became the first foreign invaders to occupy American soil since the British burned the White House. They took American citizens prisoner, the indigenous Unangan people, and shipped them off to prison camps in Japan, where half of them would die. An American priest was executed right there in the snow. The invasion had begun. But here is where the betrayal starts. When Washington found out, did they sound the alarm? Did they rally the nation? No. They panicked. They knew that if the American public realized the enemy was literally walking on US territory, it would cause mass hysteria. So, they kept it quiet. They downplayed it. They treated it like a minor nuisance. And when they finally decided to take the islands back, they made a decision that was essentially a death sentence for thousands of young Americans. The War Department looked at their maps and decided they needed to send in the 7th Infantry Division. Now, pay close attention to this, because this is where the incompetence turns into criminal negligence. The 7th Infantry was a crack unit, tough as nails, but they had been training in the Mojave Desert. They were known as the Desert Rats. They were training to fight Rommel in North Africa. They were acclimated to 110-degree heat, sand, and sun. So, naturally, the geniuses at the Pentagon decided to take these boys, wearing thin summer uniforms, leather boots meant for sand, and no cold weather gear, and drop them onto an Arctic island where the temperature rarely rose above freezing and the ground was a mixture of ice and volcanic sludge. They were told it would be a 3-day operation. A cakewalk. They were told the Japanese would run at the first sight of them. They were lied to. When the transport ships arrived off the coast of Attu in May 1943, the soldiers looked out at the island. It looked like a corpse rising out of the sea. Jagged black peaks covered in snow, shrouded in a dense, unnatural fog. The locals called the weather Willy Wars, sudden, violent storms that could rip a man off his feet and throw him into the freezing ocean. The soldiers shivered in their summer fatigues, clutching rifles that were already starting to rust in the salt air. They had no idea that they were about to step into a meat grinder. The landing was a disaster from minute one. The fog was so thick the landing craft could not find the beaches. Men were soaked to the bone before they even fired a shot. And when they finally hit the shore of what was called Massacre Valley, a name that proved to be a dark prophecy. They found nothing. The beach was empty. No machine gun fire.
No bunkers.
Just the howling wind and the cry of seabirds. The commanders relaxed. "See," they said. "The Japanese have fled. We'll secure the island by dinner." But the Japanese had not fled. Their commander, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, was a brilliant tactician who knew he could not win a battle on the beach against American naval guns. So he did something the Americans did not expect. He conceded the coast. He moved his entire army up into the mountains, into the fog, into the caves and ridges overlooking the valleys. He turned the high ground into a fortress of tunnels and sniper nests. He ordered his men to hold their fire, to wait, to let the Americans walk right into the trap. And walk they did. The American columns pushed inland, struggling through mud that was knee-deep. Vehicles bogged down immediately. The roads on the maps did not exist. It was a logistical nightmare. The soldiers were already freezing. Their leather boots, designed for the desert, soaked up the freezing water like sponges. Within hours, feet started to turn numb. Then blue. Then black. Trench foot began to set in before the first bullet was even fired. As they moved deeper into the valley, the fog began to lift, just for a moment. And that's when the mountains came alive. Suddenly, the hillsides erupted. Mortar shells rained down on the exposed Americans stuck in the valley floor. Machine gun fire raked the lines from invisible positions in the cliffs. The Americans dove for cover, but there was no cover. Just wet, freezing muskeg moss that offered no protection. They fired back, but they could not see what they were shooting at. The Japanese were ghosts in the mist. They used smokeless powder, so they gave away no position when they fired. Panic set in. The officers tried to coordinate an attack, but the radios did not work in the magnetic interference of the volcanic mountains. The 3-day operation was falling apart in 3 hours. Men were dying in the mud, screaming for medics who were getting picked off one by one. And as night fell, the real horror began. You have to understand the psychological terror of Attu. In Europe, there were front lines. You knew the Germans were over there, and you were over here. On Attu, there were no lines. The Japanese would infiltrate the American foxholes at night. They moved silently, wearing soft-soled tabby boots. An American soldier would be staring into the black fog, straining to hear a twig snap, and suddenly a knife would flash in the dark. The Americans started shooting at shadows. They started shooting at each other. The friendly fire incidents on Attu were some of the worst in the war, but the reports were buried. Why? Because how do you explain to a mother that her son was killed by his own terrified platoon mate because they were hallucinating from hypothermia and sleep deprivation? Days turned into weeks. The supply lines broke down. The soldiers were starving, freezing, and rotting alive. Yes, rotting. The trench foot was so bad that men would take off their boots and their skin would peel off with the socks. But the commanders refused to evacuate them. Hold the line, came the order from the warm officers in the rear. Push forward. They were pushing forward against an enemy that had no intention of surviving. Colonel Yamasaki had told his men that there would be no evacuation.
No surrender.
Their orders were to kill as many Americans as possible and die on that rock. And they were efficient. They targeted the American officers specifically. They knew if they killed the leaders, the freezing, conscripted boys in the mud would break. But the Americans did not break. Not yet. They found a reserve of anger deep inside. Anger at the enemy, yes, but also anger at their own leadership. They started to fight back with a savage desperation. They clawed their way up the mountains, inch by bloody inch, throwing grenades into caves, burning out bunkers with flamethrowers. It was not a tactical battle anymore. It was a brawl. A primal struggle for survival on the edge of the world. And just when it looked like the Americans might finally take the upper hand, just when they thought they had the Japanese cornered on the high ridges, the enemy prepared their final, terrifying act. The Americans thought the Japanese were retreating to regroup. They were wrong. They were not retreating. They were gathering. Every single soldier who could still walk. The wounded, the sick, the cooks, the engineers. They were given rifles, bayonets, and grenades. Some were armed only with rocks or knives tied to sticks. They were drinking sake and writing their final poems. They were preparing for the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. And the exhausted American soldiers, sleeping in their frozen foxholes at the bottom of the hill, had absolutely no idea that a human tsunami of death was about to crash down on them. The betrayal of the desert rats was about to reach its bloody climax. The government had sent them to the wrong place, with the wrong gear and the wrong intelligence. And now, thousands of screaming warriors were about to come rushing out of the fog to make them pay for those mistakes. Think about that for a second. Imagine being 18 years old, freezing to death in a foxhole on American soil, knowing your government failed you, and hearing thousands of men screaming for your blood in the darkness. I want you to pause and ask yourself a question right now. If your country was invaded, if enemy soldiers were standing in your backyard, would you trust your government to tell you the truth? Or would they hide it to protect you, just like they did in 1942? Drop a comment below. Let me know which state you're re-watching from, and if you think you could survive a night on Attu. Because trust me, what happened next makes the beginning look like a picnic. We left the desert rats freezing in their foxholes, exhausted, battered, and unaware that the silence of the night was a lie. Up in the jagged peaks of Chichagof Valley, Colonel Yamasaki was making his final move. He knew the battle was lost in the traditional sense. His men were starving, ammunition was low, and there was no hope of rescue from Japan. But for the Imperial Japanese Army, defeat was not an option. Surrender was a sin worse than death. The only honorable path left was Gyokusai, shattering like a jewel. Total destruction in a blaze of glory. This was not just a military tactic. It was a spiritual ritual. The wounded who could not walk were given hand grenades and told to wait for the Americans to come close. The ones who could stand were given a simple order: kill until you are killed. Break through the American lines, wreak havoc in the rear, destroy the artillery, slaughter the sleeping support troops, and die fighting. It was May 29, 1943. The early morning hours. The fog was particularly thick, wrapping the valley in a suffocating grey blanket. The American soldiers of the 32nd Infantry Regiment were half asleep, huddled in their sleeping bags, trying to steal a few minutes of warmth. They believed the Japanese were trapped. They believed the end was near. At roughly 3:30 a.m., the ground began to shake. It started as a low rumble, then grew into a roar. Through the mist came a sound that no American who survived would ever forget, a guttural, collective scream of Banzai, from over 2,000 throats. And then, they emerged. Like demons materializing from the fog, the Japanese wave crashed into the American front lines. It was not a tactical formation. It was a mob, a stampede of desperate men. Officers waving swords led the charge, followed by soldiers with bayonets, engineers with demolition charges, and even the walking wounded in blood-soaked bandages clutching knives. The American pickets on the perimeter did not stand a chance. They were overrun in seconds, trampled or bayoneted before they could even reach for their rifles. The Japanese wave did not stop to secure the line. They just kept running. They poured over the foxholes, stabbing and shooting anything that moved, sprinting toward the rear echelons. This is where the fog of war became literal chaos. The Americans in the rear, cooks, medics, radio operators, supply clerks, woke up to find the war standing over their beds. These were not combat infantrymen. They were not trained for hand-to-hand combat. They were the support staff. And suddenly, they were fighting for their lives against battle-hardened shock troops. The scene in the valley was a nightmare of confusion. Because of the fog and the chaotic melee, American artillery could not fire for fear of hitting their own men. It became a medieval brawl. Men fought with entrenching tools, rocks, fists, and helmet straps. There are stories from that morning that sound like pure fiction, but are documented in the grim reports of the aftermath. One American medic, seeing a Japanese officer charging at his tent with a sword, grabbed a crate of Conspam and threw it with such force that it knocked the officer down, giving a nearby engineer enough time to shoot him. Another group of American engineers, realizing their position was being overrun, grabbed their bulldozers and trucks. They used the vehicles as mobile shields, creating a makeshift barricade of steel to hold back the human tide. They fired carbines from behind tires and engine blocks, the metal pinging with enemy bullets. But the most terrifying aspect of the charge was not the violence, it was the relentlessness. The Japanese soldiers were not trying to capture ground. They were trying to die. If an American machine gun opened up, they did not take cover. They ran directly into the bullets, their bodies piling up until they blocked the line of fire for the next wave. It was a level of fanaticism the Americans simply could not comprehend. The breakthrough pushed miles deep into the American territory. They reached the Cleavesy Pass, threatening the main American headquarters. General Archibald Arnold, the American commander, was nearly captured in his pajamas. He had to organize a defense line made up of anyone who could hold a gun: typists, drivers, chaplains. They formed a thin, desperate line known as the Engineer Hill. This was the Alamo of the Aleutians. A ragtag group of non-combatants holding the high ground against 1,000 screaming warriors. If Engineer Hill fell, the Japanese would seize the American artillery and turn the big guns on the landing beaches. The entire invasion force could be wiped out. 4 hours, the battle raged on that hill. It was point-blank carnage. Grenades were thrown back and forth like baseballs. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. But slowly, the sheer firepower of the Americans began to tell. The desert rats, adapting to their hellish environment, held the line. They mowed down wave after wave until the Japanese momentum finally broke. And then came the silence. As the sun tried to burn through the fog, the surviving Japanese soldiers realized they had failed to break the American army. They had not driven the invaders into the sea. And so, they turned to the final phase of their orders. What the Americans witnessed next was a scene of horror that haunted them for the rest of their lives. All across the valley, as the charge faltered, the Japanese soldiers began to pull the pins on their grenades. But they did not throw them. They held them to their chests. Or they placed the muzzles of their rifles under their chins and pulled the triggers with their toes. It was mass suicide on an industrial scale. 500 men took their own lives in the span of an hour. The valley floor was littered with bodies. It looked, as one survivor described it, like the inside of a slaughterhouse. When the Americans finally walked through the battlefield the next morning, the silence was heavier than the fog. They found Colonel Yamasaki's body near the front of the charge, sword in hand. He had died leading his men. Out of the roughly 2,400 Japanese soldiers on the island, only 28 surrendered. 28. Everyone else, over 2,300 men, was dead. But the American toll was staggering too. The 3-day operation had taken 3 weeks. Over 500 Americans were dead. Another 1,200 were wounded. But the most shocking statistic was this: for every 1 American killed in combat, 2 were taken out by the cold. Trench foot, frostbite, and exposure had decimated the ranks. The desert rats had been broken not by bullets, but by the incompetence of their own leaders who sent them into the Arctic in summer clothes. The battle was over. The American flag was raised back over Attu. But there were no parades, no newsreels cheering the victory. The government slapped a top-secret stamp on the photos of the mass suicide and the frozen American bodies. They did not want the public to see the cost. They did not want mothers to ask why their sons died fighting on American soil against an enemy that should not have been there. But the story does not end on Attu, because while the soldiers were dying in the snow, another invasion was happening. An invasion of Kiska, the sister island. And if you think Attu was a tragedy of errors, what happened at Kiska was a farce so dark it borders on insanity. The military, stung by the bloodbath at Attu, decided they would not make the same mistake twice. For Kiska, they assembled a massive force. Over 30,000 American troops. Another 5,000 Canadians. A huge naval armada with battleships and destroyers. They bombed the island for weeks. Pilots reported seeing heavy anti-aircraft fire, trucks moving on the roads, radio traffic. Intelligence estimated there were 10,000 Japanese dug in on Kiska, ready for another fight to the death. The commanders prepared for the worst. They issued heavy winter gear this time. They brought in the elite Devil S Brigade, a joint US-Canadian Special Forces unit. They were ready for a bloodier version of Attu. On August 15, 1943, the invasion of Kiska began. The ships unleashed a hellish bombardment. The troops stormed the beaches, weapons raised, adrenaline pumping, expecting the hills to explode with machine gun fire. They hit the sand. And silence. Just like Attu. It's a trap, the officers whispered. They redoing the same thing. They re-waiting in the mountains. So the 35,000 Allied troops began to push inland. The fog was even worse here. Visibility was zero. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. Contact. Someone screamed. A firefight erupted in the mist. Americans fired at shapes in the fog. Canadians fired back. Tracers zipped through the gloom. Grenades exploded. Men screamed for medics. For 2 days, the Allied army fought its way across the island. They cleared bunkers. They stormed ridges. They took casualties. But here is the twist. The twist that makes this the most embarrassing moment in US military history. When the fog finally lifted on the 3rd day, and the troops reached the Japanese main base, they found it empty. Completely empty. There were no Japanese on Kiska. Not one. The 10,000 troops intelligence had sworn were there. Gone. 3 weeks before the invasion, under the cover of that same thick fog, the Japanese Navy had slipped in with cruisers and destroyers and evacuated the entire garrison in less than an hour. They had taken everyone. They left behind nothing but a few dogs and a sign that rudely told the Americans to go to hell. The anti-aircraft fire the pilots saw. Exploding gas drums left on timers. The radio traffic. Recordings playing on loops. The trucks. Tricks of the light and shadow. But wait. If there were no Japanese, who were the soldiers shooting at for 2 days? They were shooting at each other. In the confusion and fog, American units had engaged Canadian units. Scared teenagers fired at shadows that turned out to be rocks or their own friends. They tripped booby traps left by the Japanese. A destroyer hit a stray Japanese mine in the harbor. The final toll for the Battle of Kiska, a battle against an enemy that was not there. Over 300 Allied soldiers dead or wounded. Let that sink in. 300 men killed or maimed liberating an empty rock. They died from friendly fire, mines, frostbite, and accidents. They died for absolutely nothing. The perfect invasion, the generals called it later, trying to spin the narrative. They claimed it was a great training exercise. But the soldiers knew the truth. They had been chasing ghosts. The Battle of the Aleutians was finally over. The Japanese were gone. American soil was reclaimed. But the cost was a stain on the conscience of the High Command. Thousands of casualties. A brutal, medieval slaughter on Attu. A humiliating, tragic farce on Kiska. And yet, you've probably never heard this story in school. Why? Because it does not fit the narrative. It is not the heroic D-Day landing. It is not the flag raising on Iwo Jima. It is a messy, ugly, frozen, forgotten war where the biggest enemy was not the Japanese, but the weather and the incompetence of our own leaders. These men, the desert rats and the boys who died shooting at shadows, were swept under the rug of history. But their ghosts still haunt those islands. If you go to Attu today, it is still there. The rusted wrecks of landing craft. The shell casings. The bones still buried in the tundra because the ground is too frozen to dig them out. It stands as a silent monument to the forgotten invasion. So the next time someone tells you the war never touched America, tell them about the red snow of Attu. Tell them about the ghosts of Kiska. Tell them about the day the war came home, and we were the ones who paid the price in blood and silence. And as we look back at these frozen scars of history, remember this: the greatest lessons are not found in the victories we celebrate, but in the disasters we try to forget. Because history has a nasty habit of repeating itself when we close our eyes to the truth. This was the story of the forgotten invasion. But trust me, the files I am opening next are even darker. WWII talked about the mud, the blood, and the phantom battles. WWII talked about the incompetence of the generals who treated the map like a game board. But to truly understand the nightmare of the Aleutians, we have to look up. Because while the infantry was rotting in the foxholes of Attu, a different kind of suicide mission was taking place in the skies above them. If the soldiers on the ground were fighting in hell, the pilots of the 11th Air Force were fighting in a white-knuckle purgatory where the laws of physics seemed to stop working. History remembers the daring dogfights over London or the carrier battles of Midway. But the air war over Alaska? It was a ghost war. And for the pilots strapped into those P-40 Warhawks and B-24 Liberators, the Japanese were not the main enemy. The enemy was the air itself. Imagine climbing into a tin can loaded with high-octane fuel and high explosives. You take off from a runway that is basically a strip of ice carved into the side of a volcano. And the second your wheels leave the ground, you are blind. The fog in the Aleutians is solid. Pilots called it stuffing a cat into a milk bottle. You ca not see the horizon. You ca not see the ocean. You ca not see the mountain ranges towering 3,000 feet straight up in front of you. They flew on instruments, trusting trembling needles to tell them if they were right side up or upside down. But the Aleutians had a secret weapon, the magnetic anomaly. The volcanic iron in the mountains made compasses spin like roulette wheels. Radios crackled with nothing but static snow. So these boys were flying blind, deaf, and dumb at 200 miles an hour through canyons of rock they could not see. And then, the willy war would hit. A willy war is not just wind. It's a sudden, violent downdraft that crashes down from the mountains like a giant invisible hammer. It could swat a 20-ton bomber out of the sky like a fly. Pilots would be cruising along, and suddenly their altimeter would drop 1,000 feet in 2 seconds. There was no recovering from that. You just slammed into the freezing Black Ocean. More American aircraft were lost to the weather in the Aleutian campaign than to Japanese fire. Think about that. Dozens of planes, hundreds of men, just vanished. Spun in, as they called it. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies were ever recovered. They just disappeared into the white void, swallowed by the silence of the north. But when the clouds did break, usually for only minutes at a time, the violence was absolute. The Japanese pilots flying S-6M0s. These guys were the elite. They were naval aviators, hardened veterans. And their planes were lighter, faster, and more agile than the heavy American fighters. The dogfights over Kiska Harbor were gladiatorial matches played out in a phone booth. Because of the low clouds, the ceiling was sometimes only 500 feet. They were twisting and turning just above the wave tops, engines screaming, tracers tearing up the water. If you got hit, you did not bail out. You could not. The water was 34 degrees. Survival time in the ocean was estimated at less than 10 minutes. If the crash did not kill you, the shock of the cold stopped your heart before you could even inflate your life vest. Every pilot knew that takeoff was likely a one-way ticket. Yet, amidst this mechanical slaughter, there were moments of individual human brilliance that defied the grim statistics. We have to talk about the ground war again, specifically about a man whose name should be in every history book, but is not. Private Joe P. Martinez. Remember the stalemate I described? The Americans pinned down in the valley, freezing, unable to move because of the Japanese machine gun nests hidden in the cliffs. The morale was breaking. The officers were screaming orders that led to nothing but dead bodies. The attack had stalled. The desert rats were dying for inches of ground. Someone needed to do the impossible. Someone needed to decide that dying was better than waiting. Joe Martinez was a farm boy from Colorado. He was Hispanic, one of 9 children. He had grown up facing the subtle and not so subtle racism of the era. He was not supposed to be a hero. He was just a grunt, a cog in the machine. On May 26, 1943, his battalion was pinned down below a jagged ridge called the Fishhook. The Japanese were dug into foxholes connected by trenches, raining fire down on anyone who raised their head. It was a kill zone. Martinez did not wait for orders. He did not ask for backup. He just stood up. He grabbed his Browning automatic rifle, bar, and started walking. Not running, walking. The snow was too deep to run. He walked straight into the teeth of the enemy fire. Bullets kicked up snow around his boots. He kept firing from the hip, the heavy bar chugging rhythmically. He reached the first foxhole and silenced it. Then the next. The men behind him, seeing this lone figure climbing the mountain of death, snapped out of their fear. They stood up and followed him. Martinez led the charge, a one-man army carving a path up the slope. He reached the final trench, the key to the pass. He raised his rifle to fire into the bunker, and a single shot rang out. Martinez fell. He died of his wounds a few hours later, but he had broken the Japanese line. He had cracked the fishhook. Because of him, the pass was taken. Because of him, the Japanese were forced back to their final, suicidal position. Joe P. Martinez became the first Hispanic American to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. But for decades, his story was a footnote. Why? Because Attu was a bad war. It was a mess. The government did not want to highlight a battle that was a strategic embarrassment, even if it produced heroes like Martinez. They gave his mother the medal, and then they quietly closed the file on the battle he died to win. But if the treatment of the soldiers was a tragedy, the treatment of the civilians was a crime. This is the part of the story that really makes your stomach turn. The part that explains why this is called the Forgotten Invasion. It was not just soldiers on those islands. The Aleutian chain was home to the Unangan people, often called Aleuts. They had lived there for thousands of years, surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They were American citizens. When the Japanese invaded Attu, they captured the entire village. 42 Unangan civilians. The Japanese soldiers, surprisingly, did not execute them. Instead, they transported them to Japan as prisoners of war. Imagine that. American families, grandmothers, children, shipped off to prison camps in Hokkaido to dig clay for the emperor. Half of them died there from starvation and tuberculosis. They were the only community of North American civilians imprisoned in Asia during the war. But that is the enemy doing what enemies do. What the United States government did to its own people is the real betrayal. After the Japanese took Attu, the US military panicked. They looked at the other islands in the chain, places like St. Paul and St. George, and decided they could not risk another capture. So they ordered an immediate evacuation of the Unangan people. It was not an evacuation. It was a deportation. They gave the families hours to pack. They were told they could only bring what they could carry. They were herded onto transport ships, leaving behind their homes, their churches, their boats, their entire lives. As the ships pulled away, the elders watched from the rails as US soldiers, their protectors, began to torch their villages. Scorched earth. That was the policy. The military burned the Unangan homes to the ground so that if the Japanese did invade further, they would find no shelter. Think about the logic there. To save the village, they destroyed it. And where did they take these American citizens? Did they put them in hotels? Did they send them to safe towns on the mainland?
No.
They shipped them to Southeast Alaska and dumped them in abandoned canneries and rotting fish camps. These places had no insulation, no plumbing, and no clean water. They were essentially concentration camps, but without the barbed wire. The conditions were squalid. Pneumonia and tuberculosis ran rampant. While the desert rats were freezing on Attu, the Unangan people were rotting in the damp, dark holds of derelict factories. 10% of the evacuated population died in those American camps. The government provided almost no medical care. It was negligence so profound it bordered on malice. When the war finally ended, the survivors were allowed to go home. But there was no home to go to. Their villages were ash. Their churches were looted, not by the Japanese, but by American soldiers looking for souvenirs. The ancient icons, the family heirlooms, the furs, stolen by the very troops sent to defend them. This is the shadow that hangs over the victory in the Aleutians. We retook the land, yes. We drove the Japanese out. But in the process, we destroyed the people who actually belonged to that land. We sacrificed their culture on the altar of national security and then forgot to apologize. It was not until 1988, 40 years later, that the US government finally formally apologized and paid restitution to the Unangan survivors. 40 years of silence. 40 years of pretending that the Battle of the Aleutians was just a heroic struggle against the Axis, and not a humanitarian disaster of our own making. So when you look at the map of Alaska, do not just see lines and islands. See the burning ships in the night. See Joe Martinez climbing the ridge alone. And see the empty villages, smoke rising from the ruins, while the people who lived there wept on the decks of ships, taking them to a slow death in a foreign camp run by their own flag. We have one more chapter to open. Because the legacy of this invasion did not end in 1943. The ripple effects of what happened on those frozen rocks changed the Cold War, changed the military, and left a secret so dangerous that the Pentagon kept the files classified for decades. We need to talk about what they found in the Japanese bunkers after the suicide charge. We need to talk about the technology that was stolen, and the cover-up that followed. You might want to sit down for this last part. Because if you think the fighting was the scary part, wait until you hear about the peace. How many of you knew about the Unangan internment camps before this video? Be honest. Drop a yes or no in the comments. Let us see how well our history books actually taught us. The silence that fell over Attu in June 1943 was different from the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. The guns had stopped, the screaming had ended, but for the American soldiers tasked with mopping up, the horror was just entering a new, more intimate phase. They had to go into the tunnels. The Japanese had turned the mountains into an underground city. Miles of tunnels, bunkers, hospitals, and living quarters carved deep into the volcanic rock. When the American GIs, flashlights trembling in their hands, stepped into that subterranean darkness, they expected booby traps. They expected last stand ambushes. And they found those. But they also found something else, something that the Pentagon analysts back in Washington pounced on like starving wolves. They found the paper trail of the dead. In the command bunkers, amidst the chaos of the final suicide charge, the Japanese officers had not managed to burn all their documents. The Americans found maps. They found code books. But most hauntingly, they found diaries. Thousands of them. You see, the Japanese soldier was encouraged to keep a journal. And in those pages, stained with the mud of the Aleutians, the American intelligence officers found a psychological goldmine. They read the final thoughts of men who knew they had been abandoned by their emperor. They read about the starvation, the lack of ammunition, the despair. Why does this matter? Because up until that moment, the US propaganda machine had painted the Japanese soldier as a mindless, robotic killing machine who felt no fear and no pain. The Attu diaries proved that was a lie. They revealed an enemy that was human, terrified, and suffering. But the military did not release these diaries to the public to humanize the enemy. No. They analyzed them to learn how to break them faster in the next battle. They turned the last thoughts of dying men into a weapon of psychological warfare for the campaigns in the South Pacific. But the greatest prize of the Aleutian campaign was not paper. It was metal. While the ground war was grinding on, a discovery was made on a nearby island that effectively won the air war for the United States. It is known as the Akutan Zero. During the initial attacks, a Japanese Zero fighter, the most feared aircraft in the world at the time, was hit by ground fire. The pilot, Tadayoshi Koga, tried to crash land in a grassy field on Akutan Island. But the grass was actually a deception. It was a bog. The plane flipped over, killing Koga instantly. But, and this is the miracle, the plane remained almost perfectly intact. For months, the US had been losing the air war because the Zero was faster and more agile than anything we had. It was a phantom. We did not know its speed limits, its turn radius, or its weaknesses. When American salvage teams found Koga's plane in the mud, it was like finding an alien spacecraft. They crated it up under extreme secrecy and shipped it to San Diego. They fixed it. They flew it. They reverse-engineered every bolt and rivet. They found the secret flaw. The Zero had a specific carburetor problem that caused the engine to cut out during high-speed dives. It also had poor rolling ability at high speeds to the right. This information was beamed to every American pilot in the Pacific. If a Zero gets on your tail, the new order said, dive hard and roll right. It worked. The mystique of the invincible Zero was shattered on a muddy island in Alaska. The forgotten invasion had just handed the US the keys to victory in the skies over Tokyo. But once the war ended, the story of the Aleutians took a turn that was even darker than the invasion itself. The military had seen the strategic value of Alaska. They realized that in a world of long-range bombers and, eventually, intercontinental missiles, Alaska was not the backyard, it was the front door. The soldiers left, but the scientists moved in. And they did not come to preserve the beauty of the islands. They came to blow them up. Welcome to Amchitka, an island just down the chain from Attu. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the US government decided that the desolate, fog-shrouded Aleutians were the perfect place to test their biggest, deadliest toys. They were not worried about the Japanese anymore. They were worried about the Soviets. They drilled holes thousands of feet deep into the volcanic rock of Amchitka, and then they lowered nuclear warheads into the ground. On November 6, 1971, the United States detonated a 5-megaton hydrogen bomb underground. The test was codenamed Kaneken. To give you a sense of scale, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was about 15 kilotons. The Kaneken bomb was nearly 400 times more powerful. When the switch was flipped, the ground lifted 20 feet into the air. The shockwave registered as a 7.0 magnitude earthquake on seismographs all over the world. Cliffs collapsed into the sea. Thousands of sea otters and birds were killed instantly by the pressure wave. The island itself was permanently fractured. Think about the irony. We fought a bloody, horrific war to save this American soil from a foreign invader. Thousands of men died to keep the rising sun flag from flying over these rocks. And 30 years later, we nuked it ourselves. The radiation leaks, the environmental damage, that was all classified, buried under mountains of red tape, just like the friendly fire reports from Kiska. The Aleutians became a sacrifice zone. First for blood, then for the atom. And what about the men? The desert rats. The survivors of the Banzai charge? They came home to a country that did not know where they had been. When a soldier said, "I fought in the Pacific," people asked, "Oh, like Hawaii? Was it nice?" They did not know how to explain the freezing mud, the trench foot, the screaming in the fog. There were no movies made about them. John Wayne did not storm the beaches of Attu. The veterans of the Aleutians became a silent fraternity. They carried the trauma of the mass suicide valley in quiet desperation. Many of them drank to drown out the sound of the wind, because the wind sounded too much like the screaming on that final night. But time, interestingly enough, heals even the deepest scars. And this story has a final chapter that is surprisingly peaceful. In 1987, 44 years after the battle, the Japanese government asked permission to place a monument on Attu. The US government agreed. A group of American veterans, now old men with white hair, flew back to the island that had haunted their nightmares. They met the Japanese survivors. There were only a few of them left. Men who had been young, fanatical soldiers, now elderly grandfathers. They stood on Engineer Hill, the site of the final slaughter. The fog was there, just like in 1943. The wind was there. But this time, there were no bayonets. The old enemies shook hands. They cried. They shared whiskey. They realized that they had just been pawns in a game played by men in comfortable offices thousands of miles away. They dedicated a monument called the Titanium Star. It stands there today, on the desolate tundra of Attu. It has an inscription in both English and Japanese. It does not celebrate victory. It does not glorify the charge. It simply says, "In memory of all those who sacrificed their lives in the islands and seas of the North Pacific." It is a tombstone for the forgotten war. So, why did I tell you this story? Why dig up these old ghosts? Because right now, the world is looking north again. The Arctic is melting. New shipping lanes are opening up. Russia and China are building icebreakers and bases. The eyes of the superpowers are turning back to the top of the world. History is a circle. The Aleutian Islands, those lonely, fog-bound rocks, are once again becoming the chessboard for the next great global conflict. The back door to America is creaking open again. The men who died on Attu, the families who were stolen from their villages, the pilots who vanished into the white void, they are trying to warn us. They are whispering from the history books that we refuse to read. They are telling us that the next time war comes to American soil, it will not be with drums and bugles. It will come in the fog. It will come with silence. And if we are not watching, if we forget the lessons paid for in blood on the frozen tundra, we might not be able to stop it this time. The invasion of Alaska was hidden from you once. Do not let them hide the truth from you again. If you made it this far, you re part of the few who actually care about the real history, not the fairy tales. Do me a favor, hit that like button so the algorithm is forced to show this truth to more people. And tell me in the comments, if you had been a commander in 1942, would you have told the public the truth about the invasion, or would you have kept it a secret to prevent panic? I'll be reading your answers. Stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, the map is not the territory.